Hey y'all, and welcome To Be Determined.
In this podcast, we share our opinions and talk about popular novels we've been reading.
I'm your host, Abbie Consier.
And I'm your co-host, Morgan Brennan.
Thanks for tuning in into today's episode, and we hope you're doing well. Alrighty, let's get right into it and introduce our panel of guests.
Hey, I'm Grace Prexis, and I'm super excited to be here today.
Thanks for joining us today, Grace. How are you?
I'm doing super well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
And I'm Taylor Combs. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming, Taylor.
In this episode, we will be discussing Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, the author of many bestsellers such as Outliers and The Tipping Point. Okay, so to start us off with today, Blink was written in 2005, 5 years after Gladwell published his first book, The Tipping Point. Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking, is about the decision-making process and how the unconscious mind is a powerful tool that can be good or bad. It shows how the judgments and thoughts and opinions we make in a split second or in a blink of an eye can reveal truth to us about something or someone, but can also show our own unconscious prejudice and preconceived ideas that we may already have. Blink explores the benefits and dangers of how less information is sometimes more, and the difference between expert intuition and common everyday intuition.
Thanks, Morgan. What was everyone's opinions or ratings on this book?
Honestly, I'd give it about a 6 out of 10 because, in my opinion, he over-explained many concepts and ideas, and what he wrote in for about 4 chapters could have been condensed into one. What do you think, Morgan?
I sort of agree with that. I think it was an alright book. It was probably a 7 or 8 out of 10 in my opinion. I think some aspects of it were super interesting and really thought-provoking, while other parts just seemed really long and drawn out and boring. What do you think, Abbie?
I also gave this rating an 8 out of 10 because it was definitely fascinating to read, and I like the idea of a new outlook about making decisions. But he also could have summed this up really so much smaller instead of dragging out each part. What about you, Taylor?
I agree with you guys on how he dragged some things out, but it also gave the reader a little bit of time to come up with their own opinion. And then he brought an interesting perspective on some of the topics that most people wouldn't have thought about before. So I gave it a 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I agree that there are some pretty intriguing parts, like the chapter on the Warren Harding error. And in that, I was super interested in how much our unconscious controls our bias and ideas about certain races and gender roles and things like that. From a psychology perspective, I also thought it was really cool that how much those preconceived ideas and stereotypes were shown when you had to make a snap judgment in deciding if words like babies or merchant or domestic would fit in a male or family category or a female or career category in the implicit association test. I think Gladwell used excellent examples and research in this chapter and allowed readers to do tests and experiments on themselves and be inside his thought process of this theory.
Yeah, Grace, that was one of my favorite chapters too. But I also really liked the Kenna's dilemma with the music industry and its relation to Pepsi's challenge. It showed the difference between expert intuition and the average person's intuition. And with experts, they have so much criteria and rankings to base the success of something off of, rather than an average person just saying that something was good or bad and not really being able to explain why they think that. With the research from the Pepsi challenge especially, it showed how snap decisions can affect the business world, and how even though Pepsi had higher ratings when people were just taking a sip during a taste test, Coke still had the better brand because they had higher ratings for an entire can or bottle, and that is what gets people to continue to buy their products. And personally, this was one of the best examples in the book that shows how this relates to everyone's daily life and how it can affect business and marketing industries. Another thing that I wanted to say about this chapter in this section was talking about Gladwell's style, and I found it very similar to when I read Outliers, and just the fact that the book is divided into obviously chapters, which are then divided into several sections. And I think that it just adds a really unique style to his writing, and it's very just different than what I'm used to. And I know that with the Kenna's Dilemma, like that was the main chapter, but Pepsi's Challenge was like an aspect in it. And it followed another section called A Look at First Impressions. And it just really helped to like expand his ideas. And it just allowed him to use a lot of real life examples and research and things like that. And it really helped me as a reader to feel more like connected and engaged to what he was talking about.
Now here's a quick message from our sponsor.
Lately, I've been using audible.com to listen to Blink on tape rather than reading it from the book because I have a super busy schedule, and rather than wasting my time only reading on my way to doing things while I'm driving or when I'm exercising, I can just play Gladwell in the background and like soak up his ideas while doing something else. And if you use our code to be determined, you can get 15% off your first month using Audible.
Yeah, so I tend to be a slower reader, so listening to Audible helps me keep the pace going instead of dragging it out more. I listen to it on the way to work instead of music, and this has helped me get through the book faster.
Yeah, I agree with that. Audible has really helped me to maintain my concentration and focus on the book.
We used Audible for Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, but they also have the biggest selection to choose from, over 425,000 of best-selling authors. And even if you switch devices while reading, you'll never lose your place.
So, what theme did you guys find the most interesting throughout Blink?
So, in Blink, Malcolm Gladwell relates many of his main points back to the thin slicing concept, also known as rapid cognition. Thin slicing is the way a person can quickly analyze the world around them using quote-unquote thin slices, or the limited information available to them at the time, and also previous knowledge or experiences. Gladwell writes about the advantages and disadvantages associated with this thinking model throughout the book. In the first chapter, thin slicing is introduced. It explains how a person can make snap judgments about someone based off of stereotypes without putting much thought into it. He writes about how football linemen could be very intelligent, but most people just can't get past the dumb jock stereotype. But they could possibly if they rolls on his wall. In the final chapter, the story of how police fatally shot an innocent man in his apartment is told. People would tend to think that this is because of racism, but Gladwell theorizes that the thin slicing could have resulted in a bad snap judgment based on past experiences and stereotypes.
Yeah, so to sort of go off of Taylor and the rapid cognition and thin slicing, it sort of develops more into an idea I had about another theme that relates rapid cognition to prejudice. And with rapid cognition, most people, especially people who aren't experts, make snap judgments and decisions without any other information. And without knowing any details about a person or an event, our rapid cognition is based on what is already stored in our unconscious, like the stereotypes and other skewed representations. And even though, like, for example, we know that not all African Americans are dangerous criminals like they are displayed on TV and other media a lot, we still act as though the stereotypes are true during our Blink judgments and decisions because we often see those associations. And it sort of reminded me of a term that we learned in my psychology class called priming, and how exposure to one stimulus, such as an African American male, in relation to another stimulus like criminal behavior, gets set in your mind, and the next time when asked to choose between an African American male being a criminal versus not, in a rapid cognition situation when there's no rational process, people will more likely choose criminal. Even though people may not display prejudice and discrimination, they are more likely to associate those due to the priming from things like media sources.
My favorite theme throughout Blink was the idea of intuition versus rationality.
Gladwell notes throughout the book that there is a problem in analyzing intuition. Sometimes when people try to explain or talk about their snap judgments, which is like another word for a hunch, they find themselves unable to explain themselves. And in other cases, when they talk about intuition, it causes them to lose their intuition entirely. I find it really interesting that when people are asked to explain their hunches, they often lose the power of the hunch altogether, and the fact that they can't explain why they did what they did. They just sum up their behavior in a sort of gut feeling. And I also think it's so cool how you can strengthen your intuition, and oftentimes it's even correct when you strengthen it enough.
I agree with that too, Grace. The theme that stood out to me the most was free will, because it was definitely one of Gladwell's most provocative arguments in decision-making. In the book, it challenges the common sense belief with the concept of adaptive unconscious. The common sense belief is where many people believe humans are free to choose what to do through reason, experience, and emotion, unless in a specific situation. Adaptive unconscious undermines the way we see free will by basically saying it's possible for someone to act a certain way without knowing why. Many people have negative thoughts about this idea that Gladwell has, like this understanding of free will, but it also makes more common sense in a way. Gladwell makes the idea that it's probably a good thing that the adaptive unconscious makes some decisions of our mind, or it would be too overwhelming for our conscious mind to handle. One quote that I thought explained this well, or showed it, was on page 222. And it says, most police officers, well over 90%, go their whole career without ever firing at anyone. And those who do describe the experience as so unimaginably stressful that it seems reasonable to ask if firing a gun could be the kind of experience that could cause temporary autism. This relates to free will because it explains how when they do fire at somebody, it's the adaptive unconscious in them that makes this action happen and not in their conscious mind. And this is also a good quote because it relates to the theme about rapid cognition, which was really interesting. To wrap up our podcast, what was everybody's overall recommendation of the book?
I would recommend this book to someone who's interested in or studying psychology or business. I think it would be really helpful to know how to read people's facial features like an expert, and also what to look at when trying to determine if a product is good or not, and how to base success.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think this book would be helpful in knowing what all is going on unconsciously in people's minds when making decisions. This would be interesting to think about when hearing news about current events or politics, and it can make into some very interesting discussion points and thought processes.
Although this was an interesting book, I don't think it's for everyone because some people are naturally more drawn to fiction books, and this is more informational, but I still think it was a great book overall.
This book was definitely not an easy read, and it was definitely focused more towards insightful thinkers rather than fictional readers. And this is not based for more leisure, but in more depth thinking. Thanks for listening to this episode of To Be Determined.
Special thanks to our sponsor, Audible, and our guests, Grace and Taylor.
Thank you so much for having me, and honestly, I had so much fun debating with all of you. And it's so cool that everyone can hear our conversation. I've never been a part of something so big before.
Yeah, thank you for having me too on this podcast. It was a really fun discussion, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
See you next time on To Be Determined.